Thank you. Good afternoon, all. Small crowd. I'm not at all under pressure. Okay, so I'm here to talk about breaking DNA, how we can cook malware in the lab. I'm Ram. I'm here to talk about this topic. So first, what is DNA? DNA, building block of life, the smallest unit of life or data that you can see in real life. So they define, think of it as code that defines what you do. Think of it as code that you run. So that the DNA's instructions that you execute. So that's your hair color or teeth color or eye color, whatever it is. So just think of DNA as code. That's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to make you think DNA not just as a bunch of chemicals, but also as zeros and ones and things, stuff like that. So it's a ladder-like structure. It's a double helix. We all know that. I'm here to change that perspective for you. I'm going on. So all you need to know is about the ladder-like structure has rungs. Each rung is made up of 4 chemicals, 4 bases, basically A, T, G, C. I don't want to go into what they are. All you need to know is that A and T bond, G and C bond together, and they form the ladders of the rungs of the ladder, which go on to decide, their sequences go on to decide your genetic characteristics. So let me take a quick break. Let's all refresh on what is data. Data is just zeros and ones. Modern technology runs on that. What I'm here to do is give you a new perspective. As I said, try to see DNA as code. So when I'm saying data is zeros and ones, why don't we think DNA as base 4? That is, let's say they are made up of A, T, G, and C. Let's think of them as 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, and so on. So can I use it as storage? Now when I'm talking about bits, can I use them as storage? Yes, of course you can. What is genes but apart from storing your genetic information that you're going to pass on to your progeny later? It's just long-term storage of genetic information for about your lifetime, basically 60 to 70 years. So just think of, when you can think of DNA as that, just think of something that I can code my data into DNA. So that's basically it. So I'm going to use a base 4 system where A, T, G, C again, and I'm going to assume A is going to be 0, 0, C is going to be 0, 1, G is going to be 1, 0, and T is going to be 1 and 1. So that's how I'm going to proceed. Is somebody already doing this? Yes, Microsoft is doing this from 2015. They have the DNA archival storage project. They're running from 2015, and present uses, they are being used in nanotechnology to code nanobots, and also for effective vaccine delivery, and of course in research. So we know that we can encode data now. How are we going to do it? So you got to encode your data into DNA. How do you encode? As I said, just assume each basis to be, assume them in a binary format just for your sake. Now, if this is preserved well, if you finish your encoding and if you preserve the DNA sequence well, you just freeze them, you have it forever. Isn't that what sperm freezing and egg freezing is all about? So it's very dense, it's very, very dense, and it can sustain and live long forever, basically. How do you do it? So you use a synthesizer. It is basically the cooker where you cook cook your data into DNA. So now let's assume that sequencing is nothing but encoding is nothing but placing the bases that you want in the order that you like. So that's encoding. Now how are you going to sequence it? How are you going to read it? So you go to a process called sequencing. What do? You feed a sample of data to a sequencer, and what that sequencer is going to do is detect. It's just going to detect what are the bases that I'm detecting, and it's going to put it onto a digital file. So each base has their own unique fluorescent light. Let's say A has a blue hue, for example. So it's going to detect a blue hue, say that it's going to be A, and then it's going to place it onto a digital file. You just keep going on and on and on. You just put your sample in, it's going to detect all the bases, and then it's going to give you a output file. it's going to be of the FASTQ or the FASTA format. So it's just a plain text file that is just a sequence of bases that it has detected. Now, we have read the data. Now I'm going to the complication. What if the input data, so what happens typically is, so this data, this FASTQ file is fed to an analysis software. The analysis of what are we going to do? We are going to compare our output with a known database to see if they are matching. If this is a DNA sample of a bacteria, is this a human DNA sample, or is this a viral sample? So we're going to compare it against a known database, and that is what generally happens in research and in that's what happens in bioinformatics research. So you have a vial of you have a sample, you compare it against known database. What I'm going to do now is so these softwares, these bioinformatics softwares are basically coded by scientists who may not be very security oriented. So they may use unsafe languages like C, C++, and may use outdated functions like strcopy, which may not have input validation parameters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to overwhelm the software. I'm going to overwhelm the function with a input longer than it can handle. So assume that the figure that you see here is typically how a buffer looks like. A buffer is where it's a temporary workspace where data is stored, and it has a very finite size. So you're going to put your data into it. Let's say it can hold 5 bits, for example. So you're going to put 5 bits in the buffer. What if I'm going to put 10 bits, for example? I'm going to overwhelm the buffer with more than it can handle. What happens? And if there is no proper input validation, then what's going to happen? It's just going to overflow onto the next nearby memory spaces. So if you can see here, I've overwhelmed the you don't see this cursor. So you overwhelm the stack, the buffer, with more data than it can handle, and then it spills onto the next, as you can see in the green zone and the very light blue zone, it just spills onto them where it's not meant to be, and that's where buffer overflow happens. And so excess data flows into places where it is not meant to be. And what if that excess data is malicious? What if I have a nefarious intention? What if I have a shell code, for example? Or what if I have a delete instruction there, for example? When flow of execution goes on from the top to bottom, at some point this nefarious instruction is going to be executed. It could be to open a shell code, or it could be to delete a file. What's going to happen? I don't want to say. This is how buffer overflow works, and how I'm going to adapt it to this situation is just put a FASTQ file, which is very long, more than what the buffer can handle, and just overwhelm the software, place my malicious code in a strategic position such that it executes the moment the actual data is read, and then there you have it. You have control of the system. You can corrupt the database, or you can delete the entire database, or you can have a remote shell session on. It's up to you. Would this work? Now, theoretically, I'm saying this. Would this work? Yes, it may. Why? Because, again, as I said, legacy code, legacy functions, old unsafe programming languages, C, C++. And how would you verify a physical sample of DNA if it has malware in it? How do you know if this is a harmful input or a harmful batch of samples? You won't know unless you sample it, unless you sequence it. You won't know what it has unless you read through it. So there's basically no input validation possible. So, and as scientists, as a scientist, if a sample is coming to me, I'm going to assume that it's going to be for research. I'm going to be assuming that I have to sample this for some purpose. I have to log this on to, and so on. So I'm not going to assume that somebody is going to send me a polluted DNA sample in that sense. So theoretically it will work. But then it did work. Yeah. So University of Washington in 2018 was able to do this successfully, and they were able to implement the buffer overflow attack successfully. It was the first case of how malicious or synthetic DNA was used to spread malware into the system. So malicious sequences were hidden within the DNA, and physical detection was very hard. So the malware is born inside the lab. That it manifests within the lab. You don't even know unless you sequence it. So that's the biggest challenge. What does this mean? As an attacker, I have the perfect opportunity here. I can be as stealthy as I can. I can be as, because it bypasses all the known security measures. It can bypass firewalls, antivirus systems, intrusion detection systems, because the threat is physical. It's not in the network. Now we have to shift our focus from from securing just the network. We also have to look into securing the supply chain. How are we going to do that? We have to do new SOPs, new principles, new laws, and all those have to be done. And even if you do manage to find a malicious DNA sample, who are you going to attribute it to? How does one know that I was the one who created and gave it to you? Attribution is really hard. So it's not just buffer overflow. I can just corrupt the entire database. The research that is going on may completely collapse, or I can just change and misdiagnoses can happen. Corruption is possible. Trust is lost on a given healthcare company, for example, because and intellectual property is lost. All data is leaked. So proprietary information, all of them are lost. So these are some possibilities. What I found really interesting, and this is away from the cybersecurity space, is that what if a DNA that has biological meaning, let's say it codes for a particular characteristic in us. For example, let's say a gene sample, which displays manifests as eye color. What if that, in some way or form, happens to be malicious to a computer? What are we going to do about it? We cannot control the gene that controls eye color. So what are we going to do about it? What about vice versa? What if I create a DNA sample that was meant to be malware, but then it found out to be a cure for cancer? What are we going to do about it? It's going to spoil the software, but then it's beneficial for humankind. So what are we going to do about it? That was my biggest question, and I still don't have answers to that. Some ideas, how can we handle this situation? Well, use better languages, use safer languages, Rust, Go, and so on, Rust, Go, etc. And then better coding practices, input validation, memory protection techniques, and then invest in talent. Bring people who have knowledge in interdiscipline, both in biology and in cybersecurity. New laws, new standards, new SOPs, new ethics standards have to be created for this situation, and hire more. That's it about my talk. About myself, I'm just recently graduated from the University of Birmingham, just a couple of days ago, and thank you. With a master's in cybersecurity. I've worked before in the DevOps sphere of things at AWS, and I've also worked in slightly auditing tasks. And my dissertation was about forensics, and I have interest in forensics cryptography. So I'm looking for opportunities now. So feel free to contact me. And many thanks to my mentor, my friends, family, and B-Sides for organizing this. Thank you very much.